Hi everyone, in this video we're going to learn about some of the things that you need to consider when you are creating high quality multiple choice questions. So a lot of the information that I'm going to present and some of the sample questions that I'm going to show you come from the book Classroom Assessment, Concepts and Applications, the 6th edition. So even though this book is an older edition, it's actually what I used when I was a teacher candidate and learning how to create good assessments, and it has a lot of good information. So if you're looking for additional information about assessments beyond what you're learning in this class, it's a great source to check out. So when you are creating multiple choice questions, you want to make sure that you are avoiding wording your questions in a way that could be ambiguous or could be confusing to your students. So if we take a question like this, all but one of the following is not an element. Which one is it? And then we have a list of our choices that we can select if we were actually taking a test. And when I look at this question, it's confusing. I have to read it a couple times to really figure out that the question is asking me to identify which is not an element. So there's a way that we could word this question that would be a lot simpler. We could just say which of the following is not an element, instead of including all this information like all but one of the following is not an element. That's confusing. Just be straightforward when you're writing your multiple choice questions, because it will make sure that you are assessing your students on what they know and not whether or not they can decipher confusing wording, right? So make sure that you keep your questions simple and don't use any ambiguous terms that could confuse them. So then you want to think about your vocabulary. So you want to make sure that when you are writing your questions that you are using vocabulary that your students are going to understand, that are at their level. Of course, if your test is actually assessing students on their knowledge of vocabulary, then it's okay to include some complex vocabulary. But if you're really assessing your students on the content that they know and not the vocabulary necessarily, then you want to make sure that you're avoiding vocabulary that could potentially be difficult for your students. So let's say that we had like a 4th or 5th grade class and we asked a question like this. A representative political system of governance is implemented in which way according to the 17th Amendment? So we have a lot of big words in that question. Representative, political system, governance, implemented. Those are a lot of words that children in the upper elementary grades may not be very familiar with. And if our intent here with this question is simply to know whether or not our students understand what the 17th Amendment is, we could simply word this question like, which of the following best describes the 17th Amendment? It's still getting at that content students need to know. They need to know like which of these choices is describing the 17th Amendment. So they don't necessarily need to know the meaning of representative or governance and things like that for this particular test question. So keep your vocabulary straightforward and age appropriate. So we also want to keep our questions as simple as possible. We want our students to be able to quickly figure out what it is that we're asking them, and we don't want to include a lot of extraneous or extra information that could potentially confuse them. So I'd encourage you to actually pause this video and read the word problem that I posted here. There's a lot of information that we don't really need to have in order to answer the question. So the question is really asking how much Billy needs to spend to buy 8 apples, and we're given how much apples cost. However, if we take the time to actually read the question or read this word problem, there's a lot of information that we don't need about like why Billy's mother is baking a pie in the first place. We don't need that information, right? We only need to know like how many apples Billy's buying and how much the apples cost, because really what we're assessing is students' ability to solve a math problem here. So we want to keep our questions simple and straightforward so we're not confusing our students. So another thing that we want to think about when we're writing a multiple choice question is that when we are thinking about our answer choices, of course, there's always going to be one right answer and then 3 or more wrong answers. And when we are thinking about those wrong answers, we want to make sure those wrong answers are plausible, or right? Because if they're not plausible, then students might just be able to simply guess the correct answer without actually knowing the information, right? So if we look at this sample question here, which person was the 16th president of the United States? I think that even if you didn't know that it was Abraham Lincoln, you could probably guess that A is the correct answer just because the other answer choices are preposterous, right? Yo Mama, Bob Belcher, and SpongeBob SquarePants were definitely not presidents. Although I think Bob Belcher would make a pretty good president, but as a fictitious character, this is not going to work out. So anyway, personal opinion there. But clearly, like choices B, C, and D are not correct. So those are implausible answer choices. So if we wanted to make a better test question here, we'd want to list other presidents to make sure that students would be able to correctly identify Abraham Lincoln as the 16th president. So you might list like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Zachary Tyler, right? Other people who have been presidents. All right. This should go without saying, but I'm sure someone at some point has made this mistake when writing a multiple choice question. But with a multiple choice question, you should only have one correct answer. Now, if we look at this sample question here, which of the following is a characteristic of an equilateral triangle, this question is problematic because there are actually two correct answers. So if we look at A and B, those are both characteristics of equilateral triangles. So when you're writing these types of questions, multiple choice questions, you just have to be very careful that you are not inadvertently writing two correct answers. So you have to think very carefully about your wrong answers. They need to be plausible, but they cannot be correct if they're meant to be incorrect answers. And then we also want to make sure that we are avoiding giving clues about the correct answer, because sometimes the way that a multiple choice test or question is constructed, we can kind of guess what the correct answer is based on the way that the question is worded. Like if we look at this example, a figure that has 8 sides is called an, and even if we didn't know, we could guess that the right answer is an octagon, because if we look at the word an, that signifies that the correct answer is going to start with a vowel because it's an and not a, right? So if we look at answer choice D, octagon, like that's the only answer that starts with a vowel. So therefore D has to be correct. So I could guess my way through that answer simply by having some basic knowledge of English grammar, even if I had no idea that an octagon has 8 sides. So you want to make sure that you're not giving away the answer by the way that you construct a question. So another thing you also want to think about is make sure that your answer choices are approximately the same length, because some students might just assume that the longest answer choice is going to be the correct answer choice, and that's not necessarily the case. You really want to assess students on what they know, not how well they can guess. So you want to just keep that in mind. Try to keep your answer choices about approximately the same length when you're constructing a multiple choice question. So if you consider those factors that we've just discussed in this video, then you should be well equipped to write high quality multiple choice questions.